10th century, Iceland. A woman walks to the doorway of her own home, turns to face two witnesses, and speaks a single declaration: her marriage is over. No priest, no permission, no appeal. If her husband couldn't provide, if he raised a hand against her, if he failed to satisfy her in bed, she could leave and take everything she owned with her, legally. Now cross to medieval Europe. The most powerful queen on the continent couldn't leave her own marriage. When she finally defied her husband, he locked her in a castle for 16 years. Why did Viking women hold rights that medieval Europe wouldn't grant for another 800 years? And what did one grave opened in Sweden in 2017 reveal about just how far that power reached? Medieval Europe's legal system treated married women as extensions of their husbands. Under the doctrine known as coverture, a woman's legal identity dissolved the moment she said her vows. She couldn't own property. She couldn't sign a contract, represent herself in court, or conduct trade under her own name. Every legal act required her husband's authority. Let that settle for a second. In the eyes of the law, she barely existed. This wasn't a fringe interpretation. It was the foundation of marriage law in England, and in various legal forms, similar restrictions applied across continental Europe for centuries. Eleanor of Aquitaine understood this better than anyone alive. She was arguably the most influential woman in 12th century Europe, Queen of France by her first marriage, Queen of England by her second. She controlled more territory than most kings. She raised sons who would redraw the political map of the continent, and when she backed those sons in a rebellion against her second husband, Henry II, his response was immediate. He locked her in Salisbury Castle, 16 years, the most powerful woman in Europe, and she couldn't walk out of her own front door. She was released only after Henry died. She couldn't have divorced him even if she'd wanted to. The church wouldn't allow it. 3 centuries later, Henry VIII wanted to leave Catherine of Aragon. The Pope said no. So Henry tore apart the religious fabric of an entire nation just to end one marriage. An ordinary Viking farmer's wife would have handled the same problem at her doorstep, somewhere between breakfast and lunch. But here's the question that matters. Were Viking women genuinely freer? Or is that modern wishful thinking projected onto a past we'd like to admire? The evidence is clear. But first, the myth. You've seen the image. Viking women spinning quietly in the background while men sail and fight. Passive and domestic, all but invisible in the stories that survived. The archaeological and legal record tells a completely different story. The Grages, pronounced Grágás, is Iceland's earliest surviving legal code. Compiled in the 12th century, it draws on laws that had governed Norse communities for generations. And buried in its marriage clauses, something that would have been flat-out illegal anywhere else in medieval Europe. A woman could initiate divorce, not theoretically, not with aristocratic connections or papal dispensation, but practically. The procedure was specific, public, and final. She made her declaration 3 times, once at the marital bed, before witnesses, once at the main door of the household, and once at the local assembly, the thing where the community formally acknowledged the dissolution. 3 statements, 3 locations done. In a settlement of 40 or 50 people everyone knew by sundown. The grounds were remarkably broad. If her husband failed to provide adequately for the household, she could leave. If he struck her, she could leave. If he wore clothing considered feminine by Norse standards, she could leave. And if he failed to satisfy her in bed, the law recognized that as legitimate grounds for ending the marriage entirely. A woman could divorce her husband for poor performance in bed in the 10th century, You will not find that in any other medieval legal code on Earth. We've talked before about how Viking grooming habits unsettled the English. That was only half the picture. The same culture that ritualized personal hygiene also built a legal system where women's rights were structural protections, not favors handed down by husbands. And those rights had teeth. A woman entered marriage with her heimanfylgja, her dowry, and received a mundur, a bride price from the groom's family. Both remained legally hers throughout the marriage. If it ended, both walked out the door with her. In England, under coverture, a woman's property transferred to her husband on the wedding day. She owned nothing until he died. This opens a genuine debate among historians. Was this progressive thinking, centuries ahead of Europe, or pragmatic design, built for a society where men vanished on voyages for years and nothing could function unless women held full legal power? Some scholars argue principle, others argue necessity. That's one for the comments. You know the modern prenuptial agreement? The concept that your assets stay yours, regardless of what happens to the marriage? Viking women had that 1,000 years ago. It wasn't optional, it was the law. But here's what makes the Norse system genuinely unusual. The Gragas didn't just protect a woman's existing property. It gave her a legal share of everything the marriage produced. If a couple built a farm together over 20 years, the wife's portion was calculated and guaranteed before any separation was finalized. In medieval Europe, a wife who had worked alongside her husband for decades walked away with nothing. Under Norse law, her contribution had a price, and the law made sure she collected it. When a Viking man sailed east toward Byzantium or west toward Iceland, the voyage could last months, sometimes years. The farm, the livestock, the trade agreements, the dependents, everything stayed behind, and every decision, without exception, fell to the woman who ran the household. This wasn't informal arrangement. Viking women carried iron keys on chains at their belts, visible to the entire community. Archaeologists have found them consistently in women's graves across Scandinavia, from Birka in Sweden to Oseberg in Norway to excavations across Iceland. The key wasn't decorative. It announced to everyone present that this woman controlled the wealth of the farm. But the real weight of that authority only becomes clear when you understand what these women actually produced. Vodmal, pronounced Vathmal, was standardized woven woolen cloth. In Iceland, the Gragas laws designated Vodmal as an official unit of exchange. Taxes were assessed in it. Legal fines were calculated in it. Trade debts were settled with it. Not silver, not coin, but cloth. You've heard of the gold standard? This was the wool standard, and the women ran the mint. From raw fleece to finished fabric, every stage, carding, spinning, weaving, was performed by women working at looms inside the longhouse. Think about what that means. The women of Viking Iceland didn't just manage household wealth, they manufactured the currency itself with their own hands at their own looms. What comes next might be the most overlooked detail in this entire story. If you're still here because this kind of depth matters, one like makes a genuine difference for this channel. Now scale it up. A single large sailing vessel required a wool sail weighing roughly 200 kilograms. Experimental archaeology at the Viking Ship Museum in Roskilde estimates that producing one sail demanded 2 to 3 full years of continuous skilled labor. Without that sail, the ship doesn't move. Without the ship, the trade route doesn't open, the colony doesn't begin, the saga is never written. If you've ever held everything together while someone you depend on was gone for months, you already know what that weight feels like. The animals don't wait. The harvest doesn't wait. And nobody sends instructions from the middle of the North Atlantic. Some modern historians describe Viking textile production as domestic craft. That undersells it by roughly the same margin as calling a naval shipyard a woodworking hobby. Around 895 AD, a woman named Aud the Deep-Minded stood on a Scottish coastline with nothing behind her and nothing ahead but open water. Her husband was dead. Her son was dead. She had no army, no male protector, and no kingdom to shelter her. In medieval Europe, the path forward would have been a convent or dependency on a male relative. Aud chose neither. She had a ship built, gathered her grandchildren, freed slaves, loyal followers, and household, and sailed for Iceland. When she arrived, she claimed land in the Breidafjörður region, distributed farms to every member of her party, and freed her remaining slaves, granting them land of their own. The Landnámabók, Iceland's founding settlement record, names her among the island's most important settlers. Not a footnote to a man's legacy, but a founder. Now shift the map west, and a generation forward. Gudrid Thorbjarnardóttir traveled further than virtually any European of her century, male or female. Iceland to Greenland, Greenland to Vinland, modern Newfoundland. She gave birth to a son named Snorri, widely considered the first child of European descent born in North America, then back to Iceland, and later, according to the sagas, a pilgrimage on foot all the way to Rome. Trace that on a map. 4 crossings of the North Atlantic and a walk across Europe. In a century, when a married woman in England couldn't sign a contract without her husband's name on it, this woman crossed oceans. If that doesn't rewrite your picture of Viking women, nothing will. But not every story here is about courage and sacrifice. Freydis Eriksdottir was Eric the Red's daughter, and she was trouble. She organized her own expedition to Vinland, and according to the Grenlandinga saga, when a partnership with fellow Norse settlers turned sour, she had them killed. The sagas don't soften it. She was ambitious, ruthless, and dangerous. And here's the uncomfortable part. Viking society didn't cast her out for it. She operated within a system that gave women the freedom to act, and she used that freedom in ways nobody would call admirable. That actually matters, because it proves these rights weren't a fairy tale. They were a legal reality that produced the full range of human behavior, heroic and otherwise. What connects these stories isn't the women themselves. It's the system behind them, a framework that allowed women to own, to decide, and to move. If you've ever known a woman who held a family together when everything was falling apart, you'll recognize something here. Those reflections are welcome below. Freedom to leave a marriage only matters if there's a life on the other side. In medieval Europe, there usually wasn't. A divorced or abandoned woman became a legal ghost, unable to hold property, unable to remarry without church approval that rarely came. Viking divorce worked like a contract termination. Both parties walked away with what was theirs, and the terms had been agreed before the marriage even began. Here's the part most people miss. The reason for the divorce changed the financial outcome. If the husband caused the split through violence, neglect, or failure to provide, the woman's family could claim additional compensation on top of the standard settlement. The system didn't just allow women to leave, it punished men whose behavior drove them out. Custody followed its own logic. Children under 7 typically stayed with the mother. Older children were negotiated between families, shaped by one question: which parent could give this child a better life? Not who holds the automatic right, who has the resources. In medieval England, That question was never asked. A father owned his children the same way he owned his land. A mother's ability to provide didn't enter the conversation, and here's where it gets remarkable. A divorced Viking woman carried no social stigma, none at all. She returned to her birth family with full standing and could remarry whenever she chose. Hallgerdur Höskuldsdottir from Njalsaga moved through 3 marriages. Each time she negotiated her own terms. Each time she left with more than she arrived with. The sagas don't judge her for it. They treat it as ordinary. You read that correctly. In a world where medieval Europe treated divorce as spiritual failure, some Norse women approached marriage the way experienced traders approached a business arrangement, entering on clear terms, leaving with more than they brought in. If you've ever rebuilt after walking away from something that wasn't working, you know the hardest part isn't leaving. It's proving you can stand on your own. Viking law didn't just allow that. It was designed to make it possible. Widows may have held the strongest position of all. A Viking widow owed nothing to any male guardian. She controlled her property, absolutely. Could represent herself at the thing, bring lawsuits, and run her estate without permission from any man alive. Excavations across Iceland have uncovered women's graves with full sets of household keys, scales, and weights, the tools of someone managing trade and property on her own authority. In medieval Europe, a widow was placed under a son's, a brother's, or a court-appointed guardian's authority. In Norse society, that same moment often marked the beginning of a woman's most powerful years. But there is one more discovery that pushes this conversation somewhere nobody expected. In 1878, archaeologists excavated a 10th century chamber grave at Birka, one of Sweden's most important Viking Age trading centers. The grave, designated BJ 581, contained a full warrior's arsenal: a sword, an axe, a spear, a bow with arrows, 2 sacrificed horses, and gaming pieces arranged in a tactical formation. Every detail pointed to a high-ranking military figure. For 130 years, nobody questioned that conclusion. In 2017, a team led by Charlotte Hedenstierna Jonsson at Stockholm University published genomic analysis of the skeletal remains. The warrior was female. Think about that for a moment. Every expert who examined this grave for over a century saw a man, because that's what they expected to see. The reaction split the archaeological community. Some called it the most important reinterpretation of Viking gender roles in a generation. Others pushed back. Burial goods, they argued, don't necessarily reflect the occupant's lived role. The weapons could be symbolic. The grave could represent status rather than military function. The original team responded with strontium isotope analysis confirming a single individual and weapon placement consistent with warrior burials across Scandinavia. The debate continues, and it should. Was this woman a battlefield commander? A strategic advisor? A high-status figure buried with symbols of authority? This is genuine scholarly disagreement, and where you come down on it says something about how you read the past. What isn't debatable is this: the grave was real. The weapons were genuine. And for over a century, nobody thought to ask the most basic question: what else haven't we thought to ask? Every video on this channel has explored how Vikings solved problems, how they engineered ships, heated homes, preserved food, navigated oceans without instruments. But every one of those achievements rested on something that rarely gets its share of the credit: the women who kept the farms producing while the ships were at sea, the women who manufactured the currency, wove the sails, and made Viking expansion physically possible. They settled foreign coastlines, raised children on unfamiliar soil, and held communities intact when the men who built them were an ocean away. Viking society didn't succeed because half its population was extraordinary. It succeeded because it refused to sideline the other half. The legal rights, the economic authority, the freedom of movement, none of it was accidental. These were design decisions built into the laws of a civilization that understood something fundamental. You don't build a society by locking away half your talent. Medieval Europe confined women behind legal walls and called it virtue. The Norse handed women keys and called it common sense. If the real mechanisms behind how civilizations were built is what brings you here, subscribing means you'll see where this story goes next. There is a great deal more to uncover. 1,000 years ago, a woman stood in a doorway in Iceland and ended her marriage with 3 declarations. No one intervened. No one could. That doorway still stands. And behind it, every sail, every farm, every expedition this channel has ever described was built on the work of women's hands.